kind of the ultimate reality TV show. Donald Trump at the Olympic Games.
Hello, and welcome to the Sports Pro podcast. My name's Sam Carp, and I'm the features editor here at Sports Pro. And I'm speaking to you just days after Donald Trump was sworn in as the 47th President of the United States. The 78-year-old secured a return to the White House in November, and his second four-year term is going to see the US host a Fifa World Cup and an Olympic Games, along with several other major sporting events. This week, I'm joined by Long and Ed Dixon to discuss how Trump's relationship with sport has evolved over time, the role he will play in the staging of those mega events in 2026 and 2028, and what his relationship with Saudi Arabia means for the future of golf and the wider industry. Mike's tuned in with a hat. I'm not wearing a hat. Ed was showing us a hat before this. Ed, tell us a little bit of a story behind that hat, because it definitely relates to what we're going to be talking about over the next half an hour or so.
I was in a charity shop, and for the bargain price of £3, I got myself a Live Golf hat emblazoned with Donald Trump's golf course on the back. So yeah, I was powerless to resist such an offer.
There we go. And Donald Trump, of course, is the returning president of the United States of America. Did either of you watch the inauguration on Monday? Did you tune in for that, even though it was on company time?
I'll be honest, yeah, I did. And I'm conscious I didn't watch the debut of TGL. So yeah, caught the Donald, didn't catch TGL, which may say more about me than perhaps I'd like. But I did catch the end of it, but obviously in preparation for this podcast. So it was time well spent.
We know where your loyalties lie then, Ed.
You've always been a casual sportsman, and you're a big eventer rather than a regular viewer.
Fair weather fan, that's me.
It was inside though. I was tuning in expecting that kind of, grand sort of panoramic view.
A last minute change, wasn't it? Because it was so frigid in DC.
Well, I thought Trump, the most manly of men, would put a coat on and just embrace it. But too cold, apparently. First time in a number of years. But either way though, do either of you catch kind of any of the sporting figures who were in attendance there? Obviously, next half an hour or so, we're going to be talking a little bit about Trump and maybe even kind of how he used sport to his favour in his campaign, and also kind of how he's going to influence it over the next few years. Do you kind of spot any of those figures in attendance on Monday?
He was stuck behind the tech bros, but I did spot Dana White lurking at the back.
Gianni Infantino, do you see him? Noted confidant of Trump.
Gianni Infantino laughed at Trump's comment that he wants to rename it the Gulf of America rather than the Gulf of Mexico. That drew a chortle from FIFA's fearless leader. So yeah.
Yeah, as you say, Dana White was kind of the obvious one. Trump even thanked him on the day that he won the election. Just shows you sort of the role that White and the UFC perhaps sort of played in Trump securing another term in the White House. And I was also doing a little bit of digging before this podcast, gents, and saw there were quite a few owners across the major leagues who've kind of either donated to Trump's campaign or Republican causes over the last few months. Biggest of those being Miriam Adelson, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks. She donated $100 million to the cause. Houston Rockets owner Tillman Fertitta, Orlando Magic owner Dan DeVos's family also donated to Republican causes over the course of the election cycle. So it's interesting just to kind of look back a little bit first, I suppose, just on the role that sport played in Trump getting back into the White House. How did you kind of reflect on that? And I guess how he kind of used it in a way to his advantage, because it felt like on the Democrat side, we didn't see quite as much. Whereas Trump was really putting himself in a lot of the places that are kind of, maybe going to influence certain demographics and the vote and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think as we saw in the first Trump administration, he definitely, as you say, used sport to his advantage to kind of resonate with his base, politicised various issues. There's the Colin Kaepernick and the, national anthem protest stuff going on at the time, if you remember, and he kind of weaponized it in that way to his advantage. Incidentally, Sam, I think we came across the same Guardian report there and breaking down the donors. As you say, Miriam Adelson, owner of the Mavericks, was the kind of mega donor. But it was interesting to read a bit into this. When you think about Trump coming back in and what impact he's going to have and who may or may not be concerned, I don't think many major league franchise owners are going to be too concerned with him coming back in. I think he kind of speaks their language. That billionaire boys club is very much part of Trump's base. And was it nearly 95% of all contributions from owners went to the Republican cause since 2020. As you say, huge backing from Adelson, but widespread support for the Republican Party across the NFL. I think it was the most conservative league, as the Guardian put it. Over $19 million going towards the Republican cause. I find that quite interesting given Trump's history and his, once upon a time wanting to become an NFL owner and being snubbed by the ownership at the time. It's funny how the world works, I think. But The Dana White UFC connection this time round is particularly interesting. Obviously, there was a lot made of Trump's appearance on the Joe Rogan podcast leading up to the election and how he kind of reached out to kind of young males, I guess, young white males largely. But obviously there's a huge reach that Joe Rogan has, and he leveraged that to his advantage and attended UFC events. And I think he's long admired kind of the UFC model and probably its monopoly largely on MMA and how it operates and goes about its business. Now with the crossover of WWE, and, you know, Trump has history there as well.
Battle of the Billionaires, famously. If either of you watched the Vince McMahon documentary and saw him shaving Vince's head, do you think if that had gone the other way around that Trump would have let Vince shave his head? Do you think that would have ever been in the script?
Exactly. But yes, I mean, sports clearly front of mind for Trump. It long has been. And he likes the business. He likes being around the business. As we know, he's a big golfer. I think he spent more time on the golf course in his first term than any other president in history, probably combined. But so I'm interested to see how much time he spends on the course this time round.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Joe Rogan podcast. It was interesting to see how he kind of leveraged platforms like that during his election campaign, specifically on the sort of sports and entertainment side of things. Obviously, just said Joe Rogan podcast, turned up to UFC events, didn't do it sort of under the radar either. He was like giving a big welcome whenever he did go along to those events, and also appearing on Bryson DeChambeau's YouTube channel, playing around a golf with him and sort of being interviewed in that way. And kind of the way he approached this election, he was sort of showing up in places that were kind of putting him in front of, you know, perhaps impressionable young males might be the way of saying it, or just like, you know, voters who kind of swing in his favour.
Yeah.
Pardon the pun. Ed, I don't know about you, but combat sports has often seemed to be a natural fit for Trump. You are kind of our resident combat sports man. What are you going to tell us about his history? And, you know, not just in like UFC, but also WWE, boxing, ties to those sports.
Yeah, sticking with Dana White, he's just been added to the meta board, and obviously Mark Zuckerberg is one of the tech bros cozying up with Trump, so it's kind of that rewiring of sport, politics and power. If you sort of go through the weeds, if you like, it's all very interconnected. So TKO has been linked with starting a new boxing league with Saudi Arabia, and obviously the UFC and WWE already have close ties to the region. I think WWE announced that Royal Rumble, one of their events, is going to Saudi Arabia 2026, so that's another one. I guess what I found quite interesting is the way he's been using those sort of more blue collar sports, really doubling down on them to get exposure, being seen with, you know, Musk, White and others at USC events and things like that. But I think they're kind of a perfect encapsulation of what Donald Trump is in terms of politically. There's a lot of show. It's very sort of heart on your sleeve kind of thing. It's what he's about and getting his message out there. It's the ideal stage for him, a WWE or a boxing or a UFC, compared to, I don't know, maybe paddle, for example. That was the first one that came into my head, but you take my point.
You can't imagine Donald imagine him playing pickleball maybe eventually at some point. But yeah, you're right. It does kind of seem to lean a little bit more towards those kind of, where there's theatre around those events. Notice that the Paul brothers and Conor McGregor are also there. They could only be squeezed into the overflow room. Apparently it's not quite as much room in the rotunda as there is outside in the main seats. But Mike Tyson was there, famously fought at a few Trump venues over his career. But I guess kind of looking ahead now that Trump is in office, with him in charge, two of the very biggest sports events on the planet are going to be taking place in the US. Obviously, first we'll have the 2026 FIFA World Cup, which is also being co-hosted by Mexico and Canada. And then the Los Angeles 2028 Olympic Games, which will kind of be like the last, I suppose, one of the final things that happens during Trump's presidency. Unless there's a change in the constitution that he tries to push through, this will be his final term. Maybe it's best to start with the 2026 World Cup. We'll go in order. You mentioned already, Mike, that Infantino was in attendance yesterday. I saw he posted a video on Instagram promising that Trump's not only going to make America great again, but make the whole world great again, rolling out his usual line about football's power to unite the world. Never misses an opportunity to promote that, does Gianni. But what sort of impact do we think Trump could have on that event specifically, and then sort of, I guess, kind of looking ahead to 2028 after?
Just to clarify, is this the same Gianni Infantino that was waving a green card not so long ago in support of sustainability and environmental concerns?
I imagine it probably was, yeah.
Yeah, I guess, sure. We all know and love Gianni in that way. I think Gianni Infantino is, always cozying up to Trump, has been for some time, fully appreciates that. I think, the American market is incredibly important for FIFA over the coming years, as is Saudi Arabia. And I think we'll talk about some of those links. We'll come on to that. But in terms of Trump's potential kind of impacts on the World Cup specifically, obviously, what he says will have consequences. It will be reacted to in the media over the coming months. But I think really this event would happen whether he got elected or not. And anyone in his office, of that high in office, will have an impact on an event of that scale happening on their soil in some way, shape or form. I think it'll kind of set the tone and some of the narratives heading into that tournament, I think. But specifically as it relates to the US co-hosting with Mexico and Canada, the US's two closest neighbours, they're already kind of strained relations with Mexico. You mentioned the Gulf of Mexico. He's vowed to continue building his wall that he started in his first term. This mass deportation of undocumented migrants and things like that is going to strain relations, let's say, with Mexico. And I think he's described Canada as the 51st state of the US as well, which is not going to exactly do that relationship any favours. There's other things in terms of his, policies on, trade and foreign affairs and, potentially reinstating this travel ban that he implemented in his first term. So all of these things are going to have some kind of bearing. I think the organisers will be very conscious of that and be planning for it. I don't think there'll be quite so many surprises given that we have all lived through a Trump presidency before, but such is Trump's way. I think there will be curveballs thrown. And I think leading into the tournament next year in particular, the focus will be on, more so perhaps than it would have been under a Democratic government, is focus on human rights issues, security issues. Trump's a vocal supporter of gun rights and things like that. And these are all serious concerns, serious issues. And rightly so. I think they should be talked about. Just because this tournament is taking place on US soil, I don't think it should escape the scrutiny that, it has done in Qatar and before that in Brazil and Russia, etc. There should be some focus placed on that, but not to say it should be the be-all and end-all. But there is a serious note here, how FIFA, how sponsors, how everyone who touches that tournament navigates the kind of Trump in the room, if you like, of this tournament.
I think it'll be interesting as well. Another one of Trump's policies, obviously, he's withdrawn the US from the Paris Climate Agreement, which is another thing. If you're talking about it in relation to events like the World Cup in Qatar, which was obviously moved to winter to kind of avoid playing in really hot temperatures. And I don't think a lot of people have realised that the US in the summer is really hot. Places like Dallas and Houston, they're incredibly hot destinations, and the US is, like the rest of the planet, warming up. And kind of Trump's decision to kind of withdraw the US from that Paris Climate Agreement is kind of, climate change isn't a priority for him. He's not really taking it particularly seriously. I think that is another thing that will kind of come up during that event and should be highlighted during that event when it happens. Like you mentioned, the scrutiny given to nations like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia. Do you think we'll see that same level of scrutiny when the event does happen? Maybe we will, more so than we would have done otherwise, because Trump is the man in charge.
I think it'll be a different kind of scrutiny just because of where the tournament is happening. And obviously Qatar, the criticisms and concerns around Qatar were slightly different, without wanting to make this sort of looking back on Qatar 2022. But we saw some athletes in the build-up to Qatar speak out on things like human rights abuses and things like that. There were, they wore T-shirts during warm-ups. Some people took to social media and stuff like that. I'm sort of wondering, are athletes going to speak out more on certain issues where Trump is being divisive, which is quite a lot of issues. So I'm sort of wondering in the build-up if we are going to see a much more consolidated effort from certain athletes in making their opinion known and without fear of consequences. I need to be careful what I say here, but I'm not saying like in Qatar that there were definitely going to be more forceful consequences, but it felt like there had to be a degree of sort of diplomacy when people were giving their opinion during the tournament. We saw the stuff involving the armband and stuff like that. I kind of feel with the US and sort of the more open kind of Western approach to freedom of speech and stuff like that kind of means it might actually be a bit more prevalent. Athletes speaking out, that athlete voice, I think might ring true, and I think it might ring for longer as well during the World Cup and indeed the Olympics, without wanting to jump the gun when we get to that. But that's my initial instinct.
Yeah, I think it will still be a kind of vocal minority who will try and use it in that way. That I don't see, to answer your question, Sam, I don't think there will be any real heightened or the same level of scrutiny, certainly not in the Western media of it, because we're so used to seeing these major events and talking about, major leagues. And in the US, ultimately, we are going to see a World Cup and an Olympics delivered in a country that is outside of that global climate accord and has just pulled out of the World Health Organization, and, it sees itself as separate from the international kind of geopolitical community in certain contexts and certain instances as well. So I think that does warrant some kind of discussion and scrutiny. And then obviously there's the, Trump's views on, mentioning gun rights, abortion. He's spoken at length during the election campaign this time around of, transgender women participating in female competition and things like that. He's vowed to keep men, quote unquote, keep men out of women's sports. He's ended D&I programs in the government and said he's only going to recognize two genders, male and female, and things like that. And this is Trump's way, isn't it? He sees the world in black and white or red and blue or whichever kind of binary sense you want to kind of split it. And it's very simplified and alienates a lot of people, polarizes, etc. So, all of these are going to be talked about. I think all of these issues will be talked about, but I think the overarching prevailing narrative heading into the tournament won't focus, I don't think, on the same issues and to the same extent as perhaps other tournaments and events have, just because of where the US sits, as a superpower of sport and things.
Populists love events that they can kind of hang people's memories off, that they can sort of attach themselves to. Boris Johnson had it with London 2012, for example, when he was the mayor, and Trump's now got the two biggest sporting events in the calendar. He's played a blinder there.
Might even take up the baton for the, there's the 2031 Women's World Cup bid that the US is due to bid for alongside Mexico as well. It'll be interesting to see kind of, as you mentioned already, Mike, the relationship between those two countries. I think it's also interesting just like the relationship between the US and FIFA now. Obviously, you alluded to another tournament happening, Mike, this year with the Club World Cup. FIFA is really kind of leaning on the US. 10 years ago this year was when the US outed FIFA for its the mass corruption scandal. So kind of Trump and Infantino seem to have played like a really central role in bringing, the US and FIFA back closer together. And I guess kind of 2026 will be the manifestation of that, I guess. I suppose LA 28 and the 2026 World Cup will be in the same way that other divisive leaders, divisive host nations have done in the past. It's an opportunity for Trump to kind of like project a certain image of himself, of the US to the rest of the world. And also kind of like, it'll be like an image of the US that I suppose he will say he's created. He'll be using LA 28, I imagine, as I said, coming up to the end of his term to sort of showcase, a strong America, look at what's happened during my time in charge and that kind of thing. At the same time, a lot of the things that you just mentioned, Mike, in terms of the policies that he's bringing in and, his stance on things like diversity, equity and inclusion, seemingly at odds with the Olympic values. I sense with FIFA, he's got a friend in Infantino. We're about to see a change of leadership at the IOC. You mentioned his stance on transgender athletes as well. Does this kind of put him on like a bit of a collision course with the Olympic world in any way, do you think?
I think it does. In that sense, for sure. It would be interesting to see what may or may not transpire around that. I don't see Trump softening his stance on, the gender issue in particular. Even if the IOC, objects to that publicly and speaks out against it. So they'll need to find other areas where they can kind of reconcile their differences. The other thing here is there's a kind of other issue bubbling beneath the surface of the US's relationship with the World Anti-Doping Agency, which obviously the IOC is a kind of stakeholder in to some extent, and the kind of fallout from the doping scandal around Chinese swimming leading into the last Olympics. The US now withholding funding from the World Anti-Doping Agency, just as it did during Trump's first term. The US Anti-Doping Agency and the World Anti-Doping Agency have been at loggerheads for just about as long as anyone can remember. But that kind of fractious relationship seems more kind of fraught than ever. And I don't see that getting much better unless one side gives. So I think when you think about the US's relationship with the Olympic movement, I don't think it gets any stronger with Trump in power. And then when you think about international affairs or foreign policy and things like that he may implement, he's spoken at length about heavy tariffs on China, up to 60% and things like that, which is going to have a significant impact on probably the cost of consumer goods and poses a bit of a problem for major US leagues and sports properties who are looking to do business again in China and take events back there and all of that kind of stuff. So just there's kind of all these other issues that may bubble up in the lead up to the Olympics. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see whether it's at the Olympics or the World Cup next year. Do you guys think he's going to be playing the role of the Emir of Qatar enrobing the man of the match in the final, whoever it may be, in some kind of like MAGA jacket or something like that, in terms of using those platforms, those tournaments, those events as kind of, leverage, as you say, Sam, to kind of inflate his ego further? Do you see him playing that kind of role on the ground at the events themselves?
More the Salt Bay role, I think. Yeah, 100%. Like, there's no way that Donald Trump is going to hide in the shadows when the two biggest sporting events in the world are on his home turf. I think what's actually interesting is that obviously the Olympics are happening in LA and California, democratic state, and I think like him and Gavin Newsom have already been sparring in the press on the back of the wildfires that have happened there. But generally kind of, California, much more progressive state, kind of at odds with Trump's own values, and there's already been some sort of noise coming out of that state that, they're not going to sort of embrace Trump's policies.
Incidentally, though, Trump has spoken publicly in support of the LA Games, saying it's going to be one of the, the best ever. Casey Wasserman has contacted him directly in the campaign and things like that. He's running the game. So, again, if it's an American-made Olympic production, then Trump will want it to be good and show America in a good light, I guess. But yeah, as you say, that's another dynamic here of the kind of federal government versus Californian government.
It's kind of the ultimate reality TV show. Donald Trump at the Olympic Games.
I think Infantino will let Trump do whatever he wants. Like, if he wants to present the trophy, then he can present the trophy. If he wants to take a penalty in front of everyone before the game, whatever the football equivalent of the ceremonial first pitch at baseball is, like, Trump will 100% be allowed to do that.
Hopefully he does better than Diana Ross did in 1994.
Yeah, I wouldn't be so sure. But I think with the Olympics, given that the Olympics has historically tried to maintain sort of like, we're not a political organisation, that kind of stance, I think they maybe tried to minimise his involvement a little bit more, keep it a little bit, opening ceremony, maybe closing ceremony, some sort of involvement, but any kind of awarding of things and that kind of stuff, I think they'll try to keep him away from that where they can. But that's probably way easier said than done.
What do we think about golf then? Because obviously, Trump's very well connected in the golf world. I mentioned the Ryder Cup happening in September, almost guaranteed to be there. I think it's in New York. It's taking place at course in New York. He's going to be there, isn't he?
I've got a thought. Do we think Trump will have cleared the way for a peace deal in golf civil war before the Ryder Cup, or do you think negotiations will still be going on? Interesting
you say, PGA Tour have handled it terribly, and, giving all the suggestions that he would have done a deal by now because Saudi Arabia have got limitless amounts of money and things like that. But, he has got close ties to Saudi. He's played golf with the PIF governor, Yasser Al-Rumayyan. He was seen at a UFC event with him recently. He's also played golf, I think, back in November with Jay Monahan, the commissioner of the PGA Tour as well. So clearly he's going to have some kind of hand in whatever deal or whatever, scenario gets hashed out. Obviously, there's the legislative kind of political hurdles to clear with any deal as well. And obviously he could easily smooth that out, or not easily, but he'd look to play a role in that if it does get scrutinised by authorities on anti-competitive grounds and things like that. So actually, to come full circle to your hat, Ed, Liv will be hosting an event at Trump National Doral in Miami in April. He's going to be there, isn't he? So, yeah, whether a deal gets done by September or at any point this year, I think whatever happens, Trump's surely going to have a role to play.
Yeah, I feel like by September, in June, will have been 2 years since that first kind of announcement of their intent to merge, wow, which is wild. Like, that's a very long time. It feels like a really easy win, especially if he wants to use sport to appeal to the masses, to be seen as that guy who kind of got it over the line. I think McElroy has spoken previously about, like, one of the major hurdles that has slowed things is the Department of Justice and the anti-competition rules that they're sort of looking over. Trump's bringing in his own people for that now. So you imagine that kind of he'll have some sort of influence over that.
Yeah, well, the talk is of an impasse and this inability to get a deal done. I mean, perhaps they would just hit pause and waited for Trump to get in office, and then things will now speed up. In reality, that's probably
magically,
the situation.
Yeah. Although McElroy did also say they should get Elon Musk involved, who he described as the smartest man in the world, which I'd advise against that. But I think a lot of the signs at the moment point to a deal potentially being done soon. The fact that Liv has just appointed a new chief executive in Scott O'Neill, I feel like that kind of appointment wouldn't be being made. And Scott O'Neill, someone who, as we know, has extensive experience in sport, very good reputation in sport from his time as chief executive of Harris Blitzer Sport and Entertainment, also at Madison Square Garden Company as well. I feel like someone like Scott O'Neill probably wouldn't have taken that job if he didn't think, some sort of peace deal was close. So the long way of answering your question, Ed, I feel like we will see something happen by the time the Ryder Cup takes place. And also because, they're going to want the live golf players involved in that Ryder Cup, I think. So that's kind of like another incentive, I imagine, to have it done by them.
Yeah, I think this way the wider industry conversation kind of leads, right, from the US as this established superpower in world politics, but in sport specifically, to Saudi Arabia and as an emerging force. And there's this increasing sense that if you can't beat them, join them. And I think the US is coming around to that. There was this huge kind of uproar when, around Saudi's investments in sport, several years ago when they started really splashing the cash. The stance on them has softened massively. I think the stance on Trump has kind of softened largely as well. And people are just almost not resigned or defeatist, but just accepting of this is how it is. And US interests and Saudi interests are becoming a bit more aligned. It's not this kind of zero-sum game. I think that geopolitical web in which sport is pretty entangled is kind of tightening, and those interests, as I say, are kind of crossing over. We've seen talk about the Club World Cup, for example, with DAZN. That's going to be on US soil. DAZN taking the global rights to that. There's talk or rumours of Saudi investment in DAZN. DAZN has been cozying up with Saudi for some time. SURJ have created a $4 billion, I think, investment fund in tandem with a US entity. What are they called, Ed? Enfield
Investment.
Yeah. So interested to see where that goes, but I don't know where they're targeting their sites. I don't know what you guys think, but it feels like there's just this kind of merging of US and Saudi interests. And I think that's the direction of travel that we're going to see across numerous sports, not just in golf, but I think other sports too.
No, you're right. Saudi economics and Trump politics, they've been normalized, and depending on your worldview, that's either great or a disaster. I think the stuff with Saudi Arabia, I think by force of habit, we're still referring to it as an emerging power. I think, we can probably dispense with that now. It is very much at the top table, and you only have to look at what it's done in 2025. We're a couple of weeks in, just to sort of that reaffirms that. You mentioned Enfield, you mentioned the hiring of Scott O'Neill, you mentioned the DAZN. I mentioned it earlier, there's the chance of potentially starting this new boxing league with TKO. There was that report at the back end of last year where sort of the Saudi Arabia, its wider influence, it's got more than 900 sponsorship deals across the industry. That geopolitical web is becoming so closely intertwined that it's almost like you can't have the US and Saudi Arabia so sort of closely linked that it feels like we're talking on them. You can't inevitably not mention one without the other, which I think points to where the wider industry is going in terms of direction of travel, in terms of sort of the wider influence and stuff like that.
Yeah, Saudi probably wants to eventually it's hard to imagine this happening, but kind of, I don't know whether it looks at the US and kind of whether it's about kind of like eventually challenging that sort of stranglehold that the US has historically had over sport as like the powerhouse market, and whether they kind of see themselves being in business with them as a way of like getting closer to that eventually. I don't know. As you said, Ed, just kind of the start of 2025, after the end of last year, there were stories emerging about them potentially spending less on sport, on international investments anyway. We're still, 3 weeks into 2025, and we're already seeing them linked, as you say, like with DAZN, which, I don't know, I find that an interesting one. But you can kind of see all the things tying together, right? Even as you mentioned, this new boxing league, that's more content. That would be more content for DAZN in like the sport that they're most involved in already, and that kind of stuff. And the mind kind of like wanders to where they're going to look next. I think one thing that you wrote about this week, Ed, I believe that you wrote the story covering the news in Bloomberg that investors are looking to raise $5 billion for an F1 style international basketball league, and you think about where they're going to be raising that money from. I'm sure sovereign wealth funds are going to be involved in those conversations. I wonder if Saudi Arabia yet to kind of really test basketball as one of those sports it's invested in, whether that's something that it would be looking at as well. So yeah, it's just interesting to see where they go next.
Yeah, no, that kind of feels, the details around that league are sort of quite relatively sparse at this point. We don't know what will eventually come to fruition. But the reports were it's going to be like an F1 style basketball league, i.e. it's going to stop off in various cities around the world. That feels tailor-made for a sovereign wealth fund looking to expand its horizons and influence. So you would imagine, Saudi Arabia's interests have peaked there. And if not them, I'm sure several other sovereign wealth funds will be interested in that.
I guess in a similar vein to, boxing and golf, basketball is one of those sports that is ripe for some, a major investor at that kind of scale and, that wields that kind of influence to come in and just kind of, bang some heads and get people, unified behind a single property that can kind of take it global in the way that F1 has done in motorsport. When you think the NBA is the power in basketball, but you've got FIBA competitions, you've got Basketball Africa League, which both of those, NBA and FIBA have kind of partnered on, but you've got the Euro League, which there's reports that kind of investors have been sniffing around various regional leagues and things. So there's potentially an opportunity there. I think SURJ has been linked with investments in tennis and cycling as well, again, to other sports that are, probably not maximizing their commercial potential, perhaps because of the political situation or the fractious kind of relationships that exist and things like that. And just, the stakeholders, the powers that be not being completely aligned and things. So yeah, I think that's probably where those funds are looking for that kind of opportunity. But I think Saudi Arabia are playing a very smart game and they just can't be ignored. When you think about the kind of tables that they sit at now and the discussions that they're in, they're just linked with everything and everyone. They've got Trump's here, they've got Infantino's here. They're playing a smart game, I think. And even if their investment does dip from here, that's not saying much because it has been sky high. It's still going to be very significant, I'm sure. Yeah. But I think the point made before, can't beat them, join them. I think that's probably the smart play from a US perspective, rather than trying to get into any kind of bidding war or going up against them too much at this point, because I think you're doomed to fail in a way because of just that limitless pool of oil money they have to spend.
Trump likes entrepreneurs, and Saudi Arabia, they're being very entrepreneurial, and he likes money as well. So I think it's an inevitable match.
There you go. I think, gents, you've given us some very good inspiration for episode names there, Mike. If you can't beat them, join them. And that's probably a good note to end on with our episode name there. So, gents, pleasure talking to you both. I think it hasn't been too doom and gloom. I think we've remained pretty balanced throughout that, actually. But obviously, 4 more years, we'll be here to watch it. We'll be chatting in 4 years' time to discuss exactly what kind of influence Trump has had. But yeah, Mike, Ed, thank you very much.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, gents.